Vamos ver aí. Prof. Crítica que comentou boa noite.
Boa noite.
Ana, boa noite. Já estamos ao vivo no YouTube também?
Sim, já estamos transmitindo.
Tá bem, obrigada. Bom, então, eu quero primeiro dizer boa noite a todas e a todos que estão conosco, não em João Pessoa, né? Vendo essas imagens, lamentamos ainda mais que não estejamos lá, mas ao menos juntos nesse momento, em que abrimos oficialmente o 12º encontro da Associação Brasileira de Ciência Política. Neste ano, pela primeira vez, o encontro ocorre de forma totalmente remota, devido à pandemia de Covid-19, e isso nos traz desafios adicionais, mas também uma emoção ainda maior por estarmos juntos em um momento tão difícil, tão delicado. Nossa mesa virtual é composta, além de mim, que sou Flávia Biroli, presidente da ABCP no biênio 2018 a 2020, é composta também por Fernando Guarnieri, professor do IESP e secretário executivo da ABCP na mesma gestão, por Luciana Tatagiba, professora da Unicamp e secretária adjunta da ABCP. Nós três, Luciana, Fernando e eu, somos parte do comitê executivo do evento, juntamente com os colegas do comitê local da Universidade Federal da Paraíba, onde, como sabem, seria realizado o evento, não fosse pela pandemia. Então, o comitê local é composto por Henrique Zeferino de Menezes, que é professor do Departamento de Relações Internacionais e do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciência Política e Relações Internacionais da Universidade Federal da Paraíba, por José Henrique Artigas, professor do Departamento de Ciências Sociais e do mesmo programa de pós-graduação, e que faz também parte da diretoria da Regional Nordeste, da ABCP, por Lisandra Serafim, professora do Departamento de Gestão Pública, do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Gestão Pública e Cooperação Internacional, e do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciência Política e Relações Internacionais da UFPB. Também, aqui conosco, parte do comitê local, Marcelo Burgos, professor do Departamento de Ciências Sociais e do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciência Política e Relações Internacionais da UFPB. Então, eu começo agradecendo imensamente a eles, que trabalharam conosco durante todo o tempo na construção do evento. Eu vou voltar aos agradecimentos daqui a pouco, mas antes gostaria de passar a palavra para Henrique, para que ele possa falar em nome do comitê local, e em seguida para a Lisandra, que também nos trará algumas palavras em nome do comitê.
Bom, obrigado, Flávia. Bom, primeiramente eu queria, também em nome da comissão local, né, que agora é uma comissão local virtual, né, e junto também com a professora Lisandra, de dar as boas-vindas, né, a todas e todos, né, e dizer que, assim, apesar da situação particular desse evento, que nós da UFPB nós estamos muito felizes, né, por nos ter sido confiada, né, a participação na organização do 12º encontro da ABCP. Tá? E esse convite que foi feito para a UFPB, eu creio que resulta de um esforço da direção da ABCP, especialmente, né, dessa gestão que termina agora, né, o seu mandato, de democratizar um pouco a nossa associação, né, descentralizando um pouco das suas ações, estimulando um maior engajamento de professores e pesquisadores, estudantes de várias regiões, das diversas regiões do Brasil, né? E além da vinda do evento para o Nordeste, né, que eu acredito que eu acho que seja a segunda vez que isso acontece, né, a criação das diretorias regionais, né, caminha nesse mesmo sentido. O campo da ciência política e das relações internacionais no Nordeste é relativamente jovem, né, com algumas notáveis exceções. Eu diria o próprio Departamento de Ciências Sociais da UFPB, o Programa de Pós-Graduação da Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, né. Então, esses dois movimentos, né, de integração da área, né, acho que eles formam um estímulo muito grande para os nossos jovens estudantes que estão aqui, né, e para os pesquisadores também, né, do Nordeste, que estão geograficamente um pouco longe, né, do centro econômico e político do Brasil, né? E, por outro lado, acho que uma questão importante também, né, que a realização do encontro, né, na UFPB e no Nordeste, né, nesse momento, Acho que a importância disso não se resume a uma dimensão estritamente institucional, né, mas também pode trazer e suscitar debates políticos consideráveis, né? Eu acho que eu diria que hoje o Nordeste ele é quase que um farol para o Brasil em diversos sentidos, né? Um deles, que eu diria mais importante, é de resistência mesmo às práticas, né, e essa força autoritária que a gente tem convivido diretamente aí de Brasília, né, e nos rincões mais obscuros do Brasil de hoje, né, o Sul e o Sudeste, que é de onde eu venho, inclusive, né, então eu tenho um pouco de conhecimento para falar, né. E o Nordeste é um espaço também de inovação política, institucional, né? Vejamos aí a experiência do Consórcio Nordeste, né? Que tem sido, inclusive, objeto de debates muito importantes, né? Nesse encontro, em algumas mesas que a gente já organizou, né? E eu diria também que o Nordeste é um campo aberto, né? E muito fértil para diversas experiências, né, culturais, também inovadoras, né, por exercício da ciência, da inteligência, em seu sentido mais geral, né? Além de ser um lugar muito acolhedor, né? Então acho que tenho certeza que nada mais apropriado, eu diria, do que o encontro da ABCP se colocar nesse momento aqui, né? Mesmo que virtualmente, né? E eu espero, né? Nós esperamos, né? Que quando a vida volte ao normal, a gente tenha a oportunidade de trazê-los aqui, né? Para a realização de um evento físico, né? Muito perto da praia, né? Que posso dizer que nesse momento o mar está azul cristalino e não faria a cidade não faria feio, né, de forma alguma, né? Mas agradeço imensamente a ABCP e Lisandra vai aí complementar os nossas boas-vindas, né? Muito obrigado.
Me desculpem, eu tinha perdido o controle da ativação do meu microfone, faz parte desse nosso momento, né? Henrique, muito obrigada. E eu passo diretamente a palavra à Lisandra.
Obrigada, Flávia. Obrigada, Henrique. Boa noite a todas e todos. Aqui em João Pessoa, nesse momento, a temperatura é de 26 graus, o céu é límpido, com algumas poucas nuvens, e a brisa do mar ameniza o calor da noite. No planejamento inicial desse 12º encontro da ABCP, nós estaríamos agora no Teatro Paulo Pontes, nas dependências do Espaço Cultural José Lins do Rego, onde 700 pessoas se sentariam lado a lado para a abertura desse evento, se encontrando, se reencontrando, se conhecendo e dando início a uma intensa semana de debates, trocas e afetos. Teríamos conversas ligeiras nos corredores da UFPB, entre um café e outro, nos intervalos das mesas, das ATs. Teríamos nossas confraternizações na Orla do Cabo Branco à noite, para rever amigas e amigos, discutir as mesas, pensar em projetos, ao mesmo tempo lembrando do passado e planejando o nosso futuro. Teríamos, claro, festa, forró, mergulhos revigorantes nas águas calmas do litoral de João Pessoa, Conde e Cabedelo. Nada disso, porém, será possível esse ano. A pandemia da Covid-19 transformou radicalmente nossos planos e projetos, e eu tenho certeza que cada um de nós aqui teria histórias de sofrimento e perdas para contar desse ano tão difícil. Mas, como a vida, cá estamos. E por mais que saibamos ser impossível reproduzir nesse ambiente virtual toda a atmosfera que a cidade de João Pessoa e nós, da comissão organizadora local, havíamos planejado para esses dias, nós queremos aqui dar as nossas calorosas boas-vindas a todas e todos que, aí nos seus ambientes domésticos, na sala, no quarto, no escritório, entre cuidados com casa e crianças, abrem as telas dos seus computadores para o início do 12º encontro da ABCP. Um evento que, desde a definição de João Pessoa como sede, foi alegre e prontamente abraçado por pessoas que contribuíram para sua organização com enorme entusiasmo. Em nome da comissão organizadora local da ABCP, eu quero agradecer a Margarete Diniz, reitora da Universidade Federal da Paraíba, as pró-reitorias de pesquisa de pós-graduação e a pró-reitoria administrativa da UFPB, com especial agradecimento ao seu pró-reitor, Aloysio Lins Souto, que foi responsável por viabilizar recursos de passagem e hospedagem quando ainda planejávamos um evento presencial. Ao Centro de Ciências Humanas, Letras e Artes e ao Centro de Ciências Sociais Aplicadas, todo tipo de apoio logístico que foi solicitado para o evento, ainda em modalidade presencial. Aos coordenadores, técnicos e docentes do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciência Política e ao Programa de Pós-Graduação em Gestão Pública e Cooperação Internacional, dos Departamentos de Ciências Sociais, de Relações Internacionais e de Gestão Pública, manifestamos nossa gratidão pelo apoio recebido. Eu quero agradecer ainda aos colegas que comigo compõem a comissão organizadora local desse evento, Henrique Zeferino de Menezes, José Artigas de Godoy e Marcelo Burgos dos Santos, pela forma colaborativa e leve com que se dedicaram à organização do evento. Eu agradeço também aos colegas Ítalo Fittipaldi, Marcos Alan Ferreira, Saulo Felipe Costa, Cletiane Medeiros Araújo, Alexandre César Cunha Leite, Luciana Liaga, Anderson Nascimento e Tássia Rabelo, que contribuíram conosco em diversos momentos. A Tânia Neiva, cujo papel foi fundamental para trazermos para o evento um pouco da arte produzida na Paraíba, e ao conjunto de artistas paraibanos que muito gentilmente aceitaram veicular vídeos de suas obras, trazendo um pouco da energia, cores e diversidade paraibanas às nossas telas. Eu deixo aqui o nosso agradecimento. Por fim, mas não menos importante, eu manifesto nossa gratidão à diretoria da ABCP, Flávia Biroli, Luciana Tatagibe e Fernando Guarnieri, pela confiança depositada na UFPB e nessa comissão local, pelo trabalho cuidadoso de preparação desse evento e pela forma humana e afetuosa como coordenaram os esforços de todos nós envolvidos nesse trabalho coletivo. Ao Camilo Flammarion e à equipe da Síntese Eventos por buscarem com muita gentileza e empenho acolher todas as nossas demandas e viabilizar a realização desse evento. Sejam todas e todos muito bem-vindos, que nesses dias nós possamos receptividade das terras e do povo paraibanos, e como o Christian Lynch falou na sessão dessa tarde, que nós possamos nos imaginar todos juntos, reunidos em uma nuvem que paira com a brisa leve sobre o mar de João Pessoa. Obrigada.
Muito obrigada, Lisandra. Muito obrigada de novo às suas palavras, a do Henrique. Um evento acadêmico é feito do trabalho de muitas pessoas. Depende dessa relação que se estabeleceu, né, e que fica muito evidente nessas falas, depende de suporte institucional, depende de recursos. Eu agradeço mais uma vez ao comitê local, ao Henrique, à Lisandra, ao Marcelo, ao José Artigas e à diretoria da ABCP, em especial à Luciana Tatagiba e ao Fernando Guarnieri, mas a toda a diretoria também, pelo trabalho, pela tranquilidade, pelo afeto que marcaram esse processo e estiveram presentes em cada reunião e decisão que tivemos que tomar. Sobretudo as mais desafiadoras, que foram, primeiro, a de suspender o evento presencial. Depois, a de realizá-lo em modalidade remota, quando entendemos que adiar para o próximo ano não garantiria um evento presencial, com tantas incertezas. Nesse processo, contamos também com o trabalho, com o apoio fundamental, já mencionado pela Lisandra, da Síntese Eventos. Então, eu agradeço de novo ao Camilo Flammarion, à Ana Maria Machado e a toda a equipe pelo profissionalismo e também pela maneira tranquila de trabalhar e de pensar conjuntamente os desafios que se apresentaram. Agradeço a Michele Prazeres e Rafael Burgos, da comunicação da ABCP, e a Alessandra Moreira Fonseca, da Secretaria da ABCP, que também nos apoiaram durante todo o processo. Esse encontro contou com o apoio institucional fundamental da Universidade Federal da Paraíba, já mencionada, do CNPq, da Fundação Ford, da Fundação Konrad Adenauer, da ONU Mulheres e do gabinete da deputada federal Maria do Rosário, do Partido dos Trabalhadores. Eu quero agradecer também, além desses nomes já mencionados e das instituições que foram fundamentais para a realização do encontro, de maneira muito especial a cada pessoa que está aqui nesse momento e que participa do encontro ao longo dessa semana. Professoras e professores, pesquisadoras, pesquisadores, pós-graduandas, pós-graduandos, estudantes, profissionais da área, convidadas e convidados de diferentes instituições nacionais e internacionais, que em condições difíceis como essa em que nos encontramos, mantiveram sua participação no encontro. Serão 5 dias intensos. Iniciamos hoje, né, já com algumas sessões na parte da tarde, das nossas áreas de trabalho, com uma sessão especial que foi realmente incrível e emocionante, em homenagem a Vanderlei Guilherme dos Santos. Teremos 2 conferências internacionais, a de hoje, que começa daqui a pouco, com o Andy Brown, o que restou da liberdade, a de amanhã, com Flávia Freidenberg, a capacidade de resistência da democracia na América Latina. Serão 19 sessões de fóruns. Eu me esqueci de dizer que, além da sessão especial de hoje, a gente tem uma sessão especial na quarta de noite sobre Covid-19, desigualdades e políticas públicas no Nordeste. Daí teremos, na parte da manhã, 19 sessões de fóruns sobre a ciência política, sobre as eleições municipais de 2020, sobre segurança pública, sessões também organizadas pelo Comitê de Gênero, Raça e Sexualidade da ABCP e pelas regionais. Teremos 28 mesas redondas, 17 áreas de trabalho com um total de 129 sessões, 18 lançamentos de livro, 6 sessões de debate sobre livros recém-lançados, e a nossa assembleia, na quinta, às 19 horas. Quero deixar o registro, lembrar vocês que será muito importante para nós que estejam conosco. Falaremos dos desafios para a ciência política em tempos de retrocesso, faremos um relato da gestão 2018-2020 e serão também anunciadas homenagens e os resultados de prêmios. ABCP ONU Mulheres, Vitor Nunes Leal, Olavo Brasil, Eduardo Kugelman. Queria também lembrar que em um dos nossos fóruns, na sexta-feira de manhã, a gente vai anunciar um novo prêmio, o Prêmio Lélia Gonzalez, que será realizado numa parceria com as fundações Ibirapitanga, Open Society, TIB Setúbal e Nexo Políticas Públicas. O anunciamento detalhado será, então, na sexta, às 9 da manhã. Convido a vocês para que estejam presentes. Nós também, na quinta-feira, na Assembleia, apresentaremos a nova diretoria, que vai assumir a ABCP após esse encontro. Nossa alegria por contar com cada uma e cada um de vocês, nosso reconhecimento da importância da manutenção desse encontro, qualificando os debates na ciência política brasileira e fortalecendo nossa associação como espaço de afirmação e renovação da nossa comunidade, não diminui, é claro, de maneira alguma, a percepção que temos da gravidade desse momento. Autoritarismo, anti-intelectualismo, negação da ciência, niilismo e desvalorização da vida nos desafiam de maneira aguda. A dor de cada pessoa que adoeceu de Covid-19, a dor de quem perdeu alguém, estão também conosco neste encontro. A pandemia explicitou camadas de irresponsabilidade e de descuido, de violência e de precariedade, escancarou desigualdades, mas também permitiu ver redes de solidariedade, o exercício afiado da crítica, a capacidade de construir e talvez a mais importante delas, a de imaginar alternativas coletivas. Demonstrou a centralidade das relações de cuidado, sua conexão com os padrões de organização da vida no espaço doméstico e público, com o trabalho não remunerado na casa, com o trabalho remunerado, precarizado, desregulamentado e as políticas públicas. Tudo isso se tornou mais agudo com a suspensão das atividades escolares e com o adoecimento de muitas pessoas. As incertezas em momentos de pandemia, mas também de desvalorização das universidades e da ciência, ficaram evidentes nos dados da pesquisa que fizemos sobre rotinas de trabalho durante a pandemia de Covid-19, que serão, aliás, apresentados no encontro, também numa sessão de fórum, na manhã de quarta-feira, pela colega Danusa Marques, a partir de um trabalho de análise que envolveu também a mim, Márcia Rangel e Vanessa Oliveira. A partir desses dados, e também de palavras que a Lisandra Serafim, do Comitê Local, que acabou de falar, colocou em uma das nossas reuniões semanais de preparação do evento. Aliás, vou ficar com saudade de vocês nas reuniões semanais que tivemos por tanto tempo. Foi muito bom conviver com vocês. Eu queria, a partir das palavras da Lisandra e também desse survey que eu mencionei, registrar aqui o nosso necessário reconhecimento e a nossa homenagem a cada pessoa que se dividiu entre as demandas da vida doméstica e de cuidado, dos filhos, de pessoas idosas, de quem adoeceu, de quem precisou de atenção especial nesses tempos difíceis, e a escrita do paper, a apresentação, o comentário ao trabalho dos colegas. Sabemos que essa será a dinâmica da semana para muitas e muitos de nós. E agradecemos por isso também, pelo esforço para estarem aqui conosco. Nos colocamos assim, nesse lugar, que fica entre a alegria do encontro e a clareza de que ele acontece em tempos difíceis, para lhes dizer muito obrigada. Sejam bem-vindas e bem-vindos ao 12º Encontro da ABCP. Nós vamos agora desfazer essa mesa de abertura enquanto assistimos ao vídeo da canção Catavento, que faz parte do disco de mesmo nome da compositora e cantora paraibana Natália Belar. Esta é a primeira de uma série de produções de artistas da Paraíba que estarão conosco durante todo o evento. Em seguida, retornaremos para a conferência de Wendy Brown. Nos vemos, então, em alguns minutos. Obrigada.
Catavento pintado, a hélice azul, o eixo encarnado, aconchegado entre os dedos dela. Retrato, tela inicial, descanso eu, correndo os olhos pela pele, me aventurando a brecha que o vestido verde dela deu. No horizonte aquarela, a flecha amarela ilumina um fio, laranja fim de sol, viu que a lua viu, a boca carne viva sem batom, rio do vento bom, mexendo o catavento e os cabelos. E o coração preto e branco, retratista de acalanto, fiz a foto em dó maior. Todo balão, serpentina, desde então combina com o mundo toda cor. Teu coração preto e branco, retratista de acalanto, fiz a foto em dó maior. Todo balão, serpentina, desde então combina com o mundo toda a cor.
Hello.
Boa noite.
Boa noite, Wendy. É uma honra receber agora a professora Wendy Brown para a conferência de abertura do 10º Encontro Nacional da Associação Brasileira de Ciência Política. Antes de continuar os agradecimentos, eu quero lembrar a quem está na sala de Zoom que tem 2 canais para se acompanhar a conferência. Um permite que se acompanhe em língua inglesa e o outro em português, com a tradução simultânea. Bom, então, first of all, I thank you, Wendy, for accepting our invitation before the pandemic to come to Brazil to participate in our conference, which I hope that can still happen in the future, and later to hold this conference remotely. Então, antes de mais nada, eu agradeço a Wendy Brown por aceitar nosso convite. Antes da pandemia, um convite que havia sido aceito para vir ao Brasil, participar da nossa conferência, o que espero que ainda possa acontecer em um futuro não muito distante. E, posteriormente, por ter aceitado realizar essa conferência de maneira remota. Eu apresento brevemente Wendy Brown a vocês, em seguida passarei a palavra a ela. Wendy Brown ocupa a posição de primeira cadeira da turma de 1936 da Universidade da Califórnia, em Berkeley, onde ensina teoria política. Partindo das contribuições de Nietzsche, Weber, Marx, Foucault, de teóricas feministas e pós-coloniais, ela escreve sobre os poderes subterrâneos e os efeitos do capitalismo e do liberalismo euroatlântico, com particular atenção às subjetividades e aos movimentos sociais que geram. Autora e coautora de uma dúzia de livros em inglês, ela é mais conhecida por sua interrogação das políticas identitárias e do poder do Estado em States of Injury, Power and Freedom in Late Modernity, Estados de Injúria, Poder e Liberdade na Modernidade Tardia, de 1995. Por sua análise crítica da tolerância em Regulating Aversion, Tolerance in the Age of Identity and Empire, Regulando a Aversão, Tolerância na Área da Identidade e do Império, de 2006, sua interpretação do interreino entre Estados-nação e globalização em Walled States, Waning Sovereignty, Estados Murados, Soberania Decrescente, de 2010, e seu estudo da ofensiva do neoliberalismo sobre os princípios, as instituições e a cidadania democrática in Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution, Desfazendo Demos, a Revolução Furtiva do Neoliberalismo, de 2015, e In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West, de 2019. Este último traduzido para o português e publicado pela editora brasileira Politeia, com o título Nas Ruínas do Liberalismo, a ascensão da política antidemocrática no Ocidente. Seu trabalho já foi traduzido para mais de 20 línguas. Ela foi professora visitante em várias universidades e contou com o apoio de fellowships como Guggenheim, American Council of Learned Societies e Institute for Advanced Studies. Ela atribui sua trajetória de pensamento às universidades públicas excelentes e acessíveis de sua juventude e tem trabalhado nos anos recentes para impedir a sua extinção. Então, mais uma vez, again, Wendy, I thank you very much. It's an honor for us to have you with us this night, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, Flavia. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. Of course, I wish it could be in person. We all wish it could be in person, especially after those glimpses of João Pessoa, but also because of the intense mutual learning that happens when we are among each other, not only through our formal presentations, but also over food, over drinks, in walks on the beach, in casual conversations in corners, and accidental meetings. So I hope for that for another time. We all must wait for better days, but I look forward to it when we can do it. I do very much want to thank Flavia for inviting me, and also thank the translators, without whose skilled and exhausting labors, none of this is possible. What I'm going to offer tonight are thoughts on what has become of freedom in our time and what its future might be. Of course, these thoughts are framed inevitably by my location in the United States. However, since Brazil and America have become cousins by marriage, the marriage of Bolsonaro and Trump, the marriage of your evangelical right wing and mine, there is probably some significant resonance of what I'm planning to say from a US context for a Brazilian one. But in any rate, we'll have time to explore this in the discussion following my talk. So this afternoon, I want to think about human freedom and its contemporary vicissitudes. First, I want to spend a little time on freedom as a singularly human need. But then I want to consider how that need has been hijacked by the formation of freedom within what I will be calling anti-democratic, authoritarian liberalism. If liberalism's emphasis on private liberty has always ignored systemic powers, such that this liberty cannot circumvent, overcome, or control those powers, anti-democratic authoritarian liberalism is a political form that brings this problem into full daylight. Divested completely from both popular sovereignty and democratized social powers, liberty within this form is more than anti-statist. It's anti-democratic, anti-social, and often, as recent refusals of public health ordinances and growing affiliation with vigilante violence suggests, it is also anti-life. This formulation of freedom has been sharpened as a potent ideological weapon against a politics of equality, care, and ecological limits. Perhaps this sharpening is a cry against the complex and humbling powers of the age, and also against the overwhelming status of the demand today to care for others and to care for the earth when caring for one's own is so challenging. Perhaps it's also something of a death rasp for modern, white, masculinist supremacy, a supremacy that has long couched its entitlement to dominate and to destroy in terms of freedom. Of course, if it is a dying of this form, it is a dying that is dangerous, threatening to take down everything with it as it goes. All right, so that's what I will be thinking about tonight. And now let me unpack this slowly. Given its abridged and distorted form today, it can be difficult to recall what makes freedom a radically human problem, even, I would suggest, a radically human need. Freedom discourse today largely figures us as being either on or off leash, in or out of the cage, commanded or under one's own sway. In short, it figures us as domestic animals trying to shake the master loose. But human freedom arises out of a distinctly human problematic. We alone among the creatures build whole orders of domination for ourselves, often invisible, sometimes even unnamed. We alone among the creatures dominate through these orders of power, cultural, economic, political, religious, social, rather than only through physical strength, command, rules, interdictions, or wiliness. And these powers, this feature of us, this is human freedom's distinctive scene. Philosophers over the centuries, of course, have located human freedom elsewhere, in the capacity to master our appetites, engage in reason or moral deliberation, act according to will based on judgment, choose one's values, identity, or purposes, or simply be our own sovereign masters. Each of these, of course, involves some wild conceits about the possibility of intellectual and moral autonomy from our psychic, social, historical, and cultural embeddedness and location. But that is not our concern here. Rather, these understandings of freedom avoid a crucial feature of the human condition, a feature that rests in Homo sapiens' singular capacity to generate powers that organize the conditions of our existence, yet slip our individual and collective grasp. Such are the powers of distinctive modes of production and consumption, of finance and technology, but also powers of culture, religion, and political organization. Such are the powers of stratification on subject constitution, along lines of race, gender, sexuality, caste, and ethnicity. These orders of power, systems, if you will, are neither natural nor divine. They emanate from human actions, yet exceed these actions as powers constitutive of our self-understandings, our potentials, our conduct, and our suffering. This is the strangely and peculiarly human alchemy generative of the problem of freedom. And the more sophisticated and the more globally integrated the powers become, the greater the problem of freedom. Rousseau understood this about the emerging political and social webs of modernity, webs that made us, in his view, so radically dependent and unfree. Marx understood this about capitalism. Weber added bureaucracy, the state, instrumental reason. Foucault would add discourse, discipline, biopolitics, and governing forms of reason. Others still would add gender, race, and post-coloniality. And most recently comes the power of digital technologies and big data. With each, if we reduce human freedom to an individual problem, a problem that is just about the individual, we elide the unfree conditions created by these powers that have escaped human control, by which we are shaped, oriented, burdened, and within which we navigate. Of course, this is the very illusion liberalism performs. It is what makes liberalism, and especially neoliberalism, such a sorry conclusion to the long historical wrestle with freedom. Locating liberty in the individual and identifying it with absence of restriction, liberalism unleashes us amidst powers that we do not control, understand, or even name. Powers that stratify, construct, contain, and sometimes existentially threaten us. Consecrated by classical liberal thinkers ranging from Locke to Mill to Rawls, and a contemporary genre of political thought in which liberalism is simply assumed. Criticisms are confined to debates between Mill and Rousseau, or liberalism and communitarianism. Neither of these debates deal with the powers with which we must be concerned if we care about freedom. Now, if all of this seems nakedly obvious, it is also firmly resisted in most contemporary discussions of freedom. And I don't think this resistance is only ideological. Rather, acknowledging the extent to which we are unfree within a range of systemic powers undoubtedly offends against the centrality of the individual in modernity, the thought and the agency at the heart of that figure, the idea that we choose what we think and what we do, and the idea that intellection is the core of this choosing. One need not dismiss intellection or choice, however, to dismantle their identification with freedom. Before we see how this problematic is specifically developed within and by neoliberalism, I want to mark one other feature of human beings that is part of the scene of freedom today. This is our species' capacity to affect and transform to the point of catastrophe the earth we inhabit. This capacity is captured, of course, by the term Anthropocene, the age in which natural and human history cease to be independent of each other, the age in which humans change the course and the pace of natural history, and the age in which this species effect does not rest on species intention. Every form of freedom inherited from the canonical Western tradition elides this, even those that do not explicitly feature the project of conquering or mastering what is haplessly often named external nature. The bearing on freedom revealed by the widely destructive effects of the Anthropocene exceeds the problem of freedom requiring limits for our self-preservation. Several schools of thought already worked in this vein. Rather, what the climate crisis and other tipping points in human plunder of the planet features is something else. Our enormous species power combined with our terrible felt impotence. Humans are the only species so powerful that we could and have become a geological force, changing the most basic physical processes of the earth. Yet, individuals, groups, and even nations often feel impotent in the face of this effect and its trajectory. Anthropocenic effects display the boldest version of losing control of the powers that we ourselves generated, an effect, a version that unfolds on a dangerous planetary scale today. And this places the project of human freedom in a new light. Not merely the destructiveness of powers we unleash, but our felt impotence in relation to them indicts all forms of freedom divorced from the chains of their effects across space, time, life forms, or ecosystems. We are thus confronted with the existential requirement of linking freedom with responsibility for the powers and the effects that freedom always wants to disavow. This is one piece of our novel predicament today. The other piece pertains to what freedom has become in the age of anti-democratic authoritarian liberalism, to which we now turn. So why this gangly phrase, anti-democratic authoritarian liberalism, that I introduced at the beginning? Why use this phrase for right-wing regimes arising from liberal or bourgeois democracies, such as those in the US, Brazil, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, India, and more? Whatever their differences, these regimes are anti-democratic insofar as they actively subvert, suppress, or cynically manipulate established electoral and legislative processes, diminish or destroy democratic checks and balances on executive power, seek to bend all public offices and functions to that power, and aim to eliminate the independence of courts and oversight agencies. They are also anti-democratic in that cronyism and corruption are normalized, and party loyalty replaces even the pretense of democratic process and representation. They are also democratic insofar as they seek to prevent citizens from being educated or informed enough for thoughtful, intelligent political participation of any kind. From propagandistic deceit to attacking the media as the enemy of the people, from devaluing education to attacking intellectuals, they seek to keep the people stupid and beholden. In the case of the United States, anti-democratic efforts also extend to corrupting the electoral process itself through manipulating and maiming it, what we call gerrymandering and voter suppression, through tolerating foreign efforts to influence and disrupt it, and through challenging its very legitimacy. All this said, the most important anti-democratic thrust of these regimes is their embrace of a form of governing reason in which markets and traditional morality are empowered to displace democratic legislation, about which more in a few minutes. So that's the anti-democratic dimension. Now, the authoritarian. These regimes are authoritarian insofar as they identify elected power with unlimited sovereign right rather than representation, and seek to employ dictate and decree in place of democratic legislation. They may also unleash the military on the people or endorse vigilantism and rogue policing to quash protests and secure order. These are authoritarianism's familiar features. However, in its current iteration, authoritarianism also involves efforts to obtain personal and party dominance through practices that jettison or end run rules and norms that have long sustained democratic, electoral, and institutional processes. Here, we have to grasp authoritarianism as a turn, a culture, an unfolding process that legitimates de-democratizing power grabs rather than simply a recognizable governmental form. In other words, authoritarianism in the West today is rarely the effect of a direct coup, but rather takes shape through erosions and replacements. Erosions of checks and balances, erosions of practices of negotiation and compromise, and replacements of all of those with what we call hardball practices of legislative maneuver, court packing, and voter suppression. In addition, authoritarianism depends on the open tacticalization of law for partisan maneuvers. Now, tacticalization of law is not unique to authoritarianism, but it's distinctive here because it's open-handed and again, normalized. Finally, authoritarianism carries an ethos today that replaces the figure of legitimate power as bound to leadership that is accountable, representative, modestly responsive, and replaces that figure with a figure of legitimate power bound to leadership in which that is equated with strength, and where strength is indexed by the capacity to crush internal opponents and threats by whatever means necessary. In short, while the authoritarian element in these regimes comprises familiar practices of concentrating power and ruling by decree, it also draws on the accretion effects of anti-democratic practices and style elements of nativist and white masculinist dominance. The latter, of course, includes machismo and braggadocio, as well as exclusive entitlement to break rules to which others must continue to hew. Finally, and most important for our work tonight, liberalism is an essential element of the new regimes, even when and where they claim to be anti-liberal. In fact, an important part of what distinguishes these regimes from earlier iterations of authoritarianism, fascism, totalitarianism, or dictatorship is precisely the ardent discourse of personal freedom, the ideology and the extension of private, civil, and economic liberty that both legitimates them and animates their popular base. Freedom is identified with unfettered property rights, consumer choice, unfettered civic movement, weapons ownership, and personal expression, but also with the right to challenge sexual and gender equality on the basis of Christian values. And the left, of course, is accused of totalitarianism for limiting or regulating any of these things. In other words, these regimes secure themselves with liberalism's prize, individual liberty, which is disembedded from democracy and often weaponized against it. This means that freedom is worthy of close examination. We need to grasp what it has become in late modernity as idea, practice, political and juridical weapon, when it is detached from democracy, when it is attached to authoritarianism, and when it is deployed to legitimate economic exploitation, social inequality, planetary plunder, injurious speech and action, and the re-Christianization of ostensibly secular orders. We need especially to comprehend freedom's operation as a political weapon disguised as a private right, as a practice draped in the innocence of private choices or expression that licenses and strengthens antisocial speech and conduct, vigilante violence, defiance of public health edicts like mask wearing or social distancing, and much more. How, in other words, have we arrived at what may be the most unaccountable practice of freedom in modern Western history, spearheaded by the right, but also one of the most ferocious political forces of our age? This is a practice that makes the licentiousness and disharmony that Plato warned against as democracy's fallen state look like child's play. This is a practice that exceeds the corruption that destroyed the Roman Republic and now diseases our own body politics. This is a practice that makes classical liberal anxieties about the masses' use of liberty for poor purposes, indulgence rather than self-improvement, seem like a silly worry. Liberty today is the contrivance by which already broken political and social orders are further dismembered, by which democracy is attacked as totalitarian while authoritarian political power is legitimated, by which patriarchy and white supremacy are advanced through conservative Christian annexations of ostensibly secular provinces of public and economic life. This formulation of freedom must not be misunderstood as a mere ideological cloak for the new authoritarian regimes. Rather, I am suggesting it is wielded as a political force to attack democracy and to advance Christian ethno-nationalism and patriarchy, and to provide energy and power for a neo-fascistic population and leadership aimed at crushing rather than coexisting with what it opposes. To understand this better, we need to turn back to neoliberalism, the order of governing reason of the past 40 years, and then we will come forward again to neoliberalism's afterlife. More than merely a free market doctrine, neoliberalism as a form of what Michel Foucault called governmentality disembedded freedom from the sphere of the social, the sphere that makes liberal freedom modestly responsible to others, the sphere that makes social movements and social justice intelligible at all, let alone as democratic. At the same time, neoliberalism severed freedom's connection with the political, where it is the foundation of popular sovereignty. More than cutting freedom's connection to both, as it reduced its exercise to a private individual matter while extending the rights and realm of the private and the individual, neoliberalism converted the social and the political into antagonists of freedom. They became freedom's enemies. How does this go? Neoliberal reason attacks society as conceptually incoherent. There is no such thing, Margaret Thatcher famously intoned, rather precisely paraphrasing Hayek. Neoliberalism identifies state-provisioned social benefits and social justice with social engineering. Always wrong-headed, because it rests on the conceit that human intention and human power, rather than spontaneously evolving markets, and spontaneously evolving traditional morality are the proper ordering features of society. This conceit about social engineering, the idea that human intention and human design are better at organizing society than spontaneous markets and morals, this conceit, according to neoliberalism, is not only misguided about the limits of human knowledge, it leads to a bloated, overreaching state, a state that is coercive of individuals and distorting of markets and its efficiencies and incentives. In a neoliberal framework, then, the social state is both misguided and dangerous. The expansion of coercive political power on which it depends curtails freedom and spontaneous order. The social state opposes the private liberty and natural arrangements generated by markets and morals, which neoliberals take to be non-coercive because we can choose within them or even against them. The neoliberal framing of the social state's multiple wrongs, its faulty epistemological and ontological foundations, its bloated state power, its constriction of freedom, its destructive intervention in the spontaneous orders that markets and morality secure, all of this reminds us that neoliberalism is not reducible to policies. Certainly it comprises market deregulation, regressive taxation, privatization, assaults on organized labor, but it is much more than that. This framing of the social state's multiple wrongs also suggests the insufficiency of Foucault's claim that political economy constitutes the internal limit of liberal and neoliberal government, that the economy alone is what the sovereign, as he put it, cannot touch because it does not know. Foucault argued that neoliberalism disqualifies state interventions in markets because political economy is sovereignty's internal limit. But neoliberalism does more. It also disqualifies social reforms headed by the state because traditional moral order is another internal limit on sovereignty in the neoliberal frame. Intervening in either markets or traditional morality amounts, in their view, to social engineering, attempting to replace spontaneously evolved orders with those imposed by humans and their faulty knowledge. Neoliberal states may establish conditions or protections or assistance for markets and moral orders, but they may not alter the conduct or the distributions within them. To do so is at once coercive, wrong-headed, and illegitimate. Now, this means that popular sovereignty itself is a danger for neoliberal orders because it's an invitation to legislate what should be left to spontaneous arrangements. Democracy rooted in popular sovereignty, according to neoliberal reason, will also inevitably aim to improve the lot of the many through redistribution and through challenges to the inequalities and the hierarchies of markets and moral orders. For that reason, all neoliberal thinkers sought to detach democracy from popular sovereignty, which they considered an anti-liberal principle. Indeed, Hayek called popular sovereignty a dangerous nonsense notion. Friedman reduced democracy to civil liberties and voting, and the Ordo liberals sought technocratic alternatives to democratic legislation, along with constitutional protections for a free market economy. Now, this makes neoliberalism a form of governing reason in which freedom is detached from both social justice and democratic rule. It makes it a form of governing reason in which the valorization of markets legitimates class inequality and traditional morality with all its hierarchies and exclusions. And it empowers both as a rightful challenger to those who would make a bid for social equality. Versions of this form of governmental reason, whether the softer or the bolder version, have prevailed in most Western societies for the past 4 decades. And they have, I believe, infected both right and left discourse with this thin version of freedom, which is less emancipatory, less egalitarian or compatible with democracy than even its liberal predecessor. The damage that neoliberalism has done to a more democratic form of freedom, in other words, is not reducible to the precarity of the neoliberal subject generated by privatization, flexibilization, and entrepreneurialization of the self. The damage is not exhausted by the survival mandates for human capital to which the subject has been reduced. Nor is that damage captured by the phenomenon in which, as persons become capital, capital increasingly gains the rights and liberties of personhood, extending its already exorbitant power in its corporate form to take unprecedented quantities and qualities of economic, social, and political domination to new heights. Certainly, all of these have contributed to voiding liberal freedom of whatever emancipatory force it once had. But we are here interested not only in liberty's attenuation, but its conversion, its inverted relation to social emancipation and democracy. As neoliberal reason demonizes the social and the political, it unleashes freedom against them. Freedom as a right of aggression against social mores, protections, and justice. Freedom as entitlement to refuse democratic principles and accountability. Freedom as antisocial, anti-political, and freedom that is perfectly compatible with liberal authoritarianism. This is what neoliberalism bore to the world. And when this formulation is also energized by the rancor of wounded whiteness, wounds largely generated by the neoliberal global economic race to the bottom, it can become freedom with a fascist glint in its eye. Things become yet darker as this kind of freedom is dipped in the acid wash of nihilism. I refer here not to nihilism in the familiar common sense, where things are all meaningless or we're totally fatalistic. Rather, I refer to the nihilism that emerges from what Nietzsche called the slow toppling of values from their foundations. This is a nihilism that has been building for centuries and reached new heights as all value today is branded, monetized, commercialized, weaponized, as truth itself is degrounded, as values are devalued, hence trivialized, but not disappearing. One consequence of nihilism, Nietzsche reminds us, is the desublimation of the will to power. That is, when values are devalued, when they lose their foundations, and hence their status as true with a capital T, what is also undone are the required sublimations of the will to power, or what Freud called the required sublimations of the instincts that values demand. And what is also undone is the conscience that emerges from these sublimations or this repression. What happens then? An already antisocial freedom, generated by neoliberal reason, is now fueled by the energies of a desublimated will to power and by the ressentiment of aggrieved entitlement. What we get is a radically disinhibited form of freedom, a freedom without conscience, that is also now vengeful, revengeful. This freedom is responsible to nothing and no one, but it's also furious and destructive. It vents its injury, its displacement or its dethronement, its wound as rage. sometimes even killing rage. In my country, this takes the form of the freedom of the Ku Klux Klan or Nazis to hold what they call freedom rallies or free speech rallies. It is the freedom of a group called the Proud Boys, an American extreme right group, to defend their vicious sexism and racism in the name of American patriotism, and their right to attack rallies for racial justice with vigilante violence. It's the freedom of the gleefully politically incorrect in both virtual spaces and real ones. And of course, you could add your own examples, perhaps the soldiers of Jesus attacking Afro-Brazilian churches or LGBT rights. In short, what I'm suggesting is that a desublimated will to power intersects neoliberal reason and wounded supremacism to generate an unprecedentedly antisocial, disinhibited, aggressive freedom. Nihilism is the fuel, but it's carried on the anti-statist, antisocial winds of the neoliberal revolution. And it's animated as well by that revolution's consecration of traditional moral order and traditional social relations. If Nazis, right-wing militias, Christian freedom fighters, alt-right provocateurs, if these are the extremes of today's antisocial, anti-democratic freedom, the mainstream moral political project of the right may cut yet more deeply into the entire social, legal, and political fabric. Here, neoliberal freedom, detached from democracy, embedded in markets and traditional morality, has become a novel framework for advancing a non-secular, non-pluralistic, conservative Christian morality in schools, courts, public and commercial spaces. It challenges gender and sexual equality not by eliminating rights, but by extending rights to those who oppose this equality, and by extending and expanding the civic and commercial space in which these anti-egalitarian rights can be deployed. In other words, by extending religious liberty to corporations, nonprofits, and individual groups, and by tucking sweeping challenges to sexual and gender equality into principles of religious liberty and anti-statism, the project of re-Christianizing nations and making family values into social truths is identified with and enabled by liberalism and freedom. Just as hate speech is draped in the mantle of free speech, just as an unbridled right to exploit workers, consumers, and the planet are draped in the mantle of free enterprise, anti-egalitarianism and intolerance are draped in the mantle of freedom of conscience and freedom of worship. Never has freedom been more celebrated on the right. Never has it been more unemancipatory, more aligned with historical hierarchies and exclusions, more compatible with an authoritarian state, more of a vicious attack dog on what remains of society and civilization. Never has it blended more profoundly with xenophobic, misogynistic, and racist hatreds and resentments. If, as I am suggesting, this formation of personal freedom as a political force is an effect of neoliberal governing reason rather than a retort to it, if neoliberalism is an important part of its wellspring and legitimacy, this does not mean it will disappear even if neoliberal economic policies are replaced or compromised. Post-neoliberal legacies in the social fabric will be deep and long. I want to make a turn now to begin the process of reflecting on what we might rescue of freedom given this condition. The right threatens democracy, the most vulnerable, and the planet, with its backward-looking vision powered by the political force of disinhibited, antisocial, anti-democratic freedom. In reaction, much of the left clings to a platform of modulating unequal wealth, access, treatment, and regard. As freedom grows uglier, can we even recall its emancipatory promise? What was freedom as emancipation? What were the Western versions and visions of human liberation from the vicissitudes of so-called nature and human powers? Plato, of course, imagined escape from the sensuous world, flights into philosophy and the forms. Augustine gave us the Christian version as fleshless and otherworldly, while for Aristotle, the few could be free on earth if they escaped necessity for political rule and contemplation. Rousseau, a little like Aristotle in his anxiety about entanglements of body and desire and need, made independence of one another central to moral and political freedom. He cast a world in which we would, in the social contract, instead of being dependent on one another, only be dependent on the social whole shaped by our common will. Hegel identified freedom as reconciliation of individual consciousness with a universal state and Christian universalism, a formula Marx saw as pure symptom of the age. Marx, our beloved 200-year-old Marx. For him, emancipation is found within rather than away from our mutual dependence. It's found on earth, for which heaven was only an inverted projection. It's found at the site of necessity, not atop it, by owning, not ruling in common, through substantive universality and equality, not the abstract versions offered by the constitutional state. Marx's critique of what he called political emancipation in On the Jewish Question remains unparalleled. In those few pages, he links the abstraction, egoism, and religiosity of what he calls the bourgeois state and the freedom it offers to the specific powers and illusions of the post-feudal age. He doesn't yet make the link precisely to capitalism, for which he doesn't yet have a name or a theory in these early years, but he links it instead to the breakup of aristocratic property relations and their replacement with bourgeois rights. His critique of political emancipation rests on a distinction of political emancipation from true human emancipation. True human emancipation he casts as our yearning, our entitlement, our destiny. This is when we would finally revolutionize the powers that keep us stratified, unfree, isolated, separated. The manifesto, Das Kapital, these are the works that would begin to clarify the conditions for realizing true human emancipation. They would involve, among other things, collective ownership of the means of production. But it is only in volume 3 of Das Kapital that Marx gives us freedom's final aim. He says, and I'm quoting him, "The associated producers, rationally regulating their interchange with nature, bringing it under their common control with the least expenditure of energy and under conditions most favorable to and worthy of their human nature. This is freedom's precondition," he suggests, but it remains a realm of necessity. Only, he adds, and I'm quoting him again, beyond production begins that development of human energy, which is an end in itself, the true realm of freedom. No grimly toiling masses for this communist. Freedom always and not equality was the essence of the matter for him, what powered human history, but also what would redeem it. Collectivization for Marx was the prerequisite, but not the realization of freedom. lost in so many Marxist screeds about unequal distributions of wealth and Marxism's bastard offsprings, state communism, social democracy, even the welfare state, was this. For Marx, emancipation is achieved not when power is collectivized, but when we leave the domain of necessity and with it labor behind. Now we are back to Aristotle, this time freedom for all rather than the few. But we are also in the web of the distinctly modern, where freedom turns out to be for and about self-realization, self-development, and inevitably, everything else is its means, its instrument, its precondition. Danger, danger, we know better now. And there's so much else that this formulation neglected. Above all, it did not reckon with or address the crucial political powers essential to handling public ownership and distribution, powers that never disappear and are so difficult to democratize. It did not address colonialism, patriarchy, and racialization apart from their links to private property. It did not address normative valorizations and demonizations of designated bodies and desires. It did not register semiotic or discursive powers, constitutive of so many hierarchies and abjections. And as it took over Enlightenment presumptions of freedom as history's telos, it did not confront our complex psychic natures and history's continuous crafting, remaking of them. Well, after Marx, of course, 20th century fascism would raise the question of whether the masses desired emancipation at all, which would lay the ground for the Frankfurt School's inquiries. But emancipation as object of desire and a historiography bound to it had already been challenged by Nietzsche, by Freud, by Dostoevsky, among others. Dostoevsky, do humans really want freedom? Do we maybe prefer bread or ease or submission to authority or belonging? Nietzsche, are we strong enough for freedom? Might the many be more inclined to reproach and moralize, to rancor and resent, than rise to the task of crafting a life and handling power? Freud, are our instincts and their vicissitudes even oriented toward freedom? Can civilization, born and sustained from repression and sublimation of the instincts, even permit freedom? And then came the searing blows to emancipation delivered by post-structuralist thought, especially but not only Foucault. If the subject is constituted and not just repressed by power, if we come into being through subjectivization, what could emancipation even mean? If we're always governed and power is not only exercised through sovereign rule or through modes of production, is freedom incoherent? Is it a practice, perhaps, an exercise, maybe an ethos, but not a state, a condition, achievement, something one ever has? Moreover, Foucault suggests, every practice of freedom is immanent to the relations of power in which it is exercised. We can no more jump out of or jump over those relations than we can jump out of our subject formation. So, arts of the self, resistance, counter-discourse, being governed a little less, like this, not like that. These are the most Foucault suggests we might hope for after surrendering the conceits of the essential subject, progress, and wrong-headed understandings of power. Where are we then? Freedom as emancipation is beset from every direction today. Intellectually incoherent after Nietzsche, Freud, Foucault, and left critical theory, including feminist and race theory working in their legacy. How can emancipation survive the collapse of progressive and dialectical historiography, of the collapse of essentialist and unified theories of the subject, of the collapse of the notion of social totalities? How can it surmount historical and theoretical challenges to the idea that humans want to govern themselves, rule themselves, even give moral compass to themselves, rather than be guided by authorities or give themselves up to markets? How can it survive post-Marxist multiplications of power, beyond adding race, sexuality, and gender to class, beyond adding political rule to control of production, beyond adding biopower, disciplinary power, and discursive power? What is freedom if we are always governed through normative orders of reason, specific rationalities that we do not choose and that are so difficult to see, to name, to know? If freedom seems unable to meet this constellation of challenges, do we abandon it or instead transpose it into a different register? Do we recast freedom as telos, as end, to freedom as a project, always incomplete? That could be one question at this point in the story, but I'm not sure it's the most historically appropriate one. The problematic with which we begin demands instead that we consider what to do with freedom now, at a historical conjuncture when it has truly gone rogue, when it has been ripped from context through which it could sustain rather than destroy prospects of justice, eco-viability, and peaceful cohabitation. When the alchemy of neoliberalism and nihilism have made freedom monstrous. What could be its place in elaborating visions and values that could both resist nihilism and script political, economic, and social coordinates by which we could live on Earth peaceably, justly, sustainably connected? What is its role in redeeming the promise that humans can govern the complex powers we generate and not only make a grievous, frightening mess from our distinctive species' capacity to generate power? What kind of freedom do we fight for now? And what kind of freedom do we use to fight the freedom that has been twinned with fascism? I do not have comprehensive answers with which to conclude. I will instead only offer a few provocations or speculations. First, I'm pretty sure that the freedom we affirm cannot be liberal. This doesn't mean, let me quickly assure you, abandoning concern with individual desires, capacities, judgments, even rights. But there is literally no room and no time left on this planet to be governed by principles drawn from an ontology that detaches individual actions from our complex interdependence and detaches those actions from the movement and the fate of the whole. If we are by nature creatures of enormous systems of power, formulating freedom apart from these imperils us and imperils the planet. Second, freedom must be bound so tightly to responsibility that the latter is known and felt as its constitutive ethos rather than its limit. Responsibility, in turn, must be extended to both intentional and unintentional effects, and to everything humans touch with their freedom. Biodiversity and planetary health, of course, but also the most delicate balances in nature, in communities, in selves. More than simply socially re-embedded, in other words, freedom must have at its heart responsibility for our extraordinary power to alter everything and anything through our actions. Third, freedom must be tethered to democratic forms of rule, not only in political life, but in work, in communities, in subnational places and spaces. Again, this doesn't mean demonizing choice and latitude. in our individual attachments and tastes and life forms and vocations, but it means rather nesting these choices and this latitude within a common good shaped by an educated, democratic people. We have been miserably served by dividing freedom into personal and political, negative and positive, private and public. We have also been misled by opposing freedom and equality, especially as the right has come to be identified almost exclusively with freedom and the left with equality. The promise of democracy is freedom bound to equality through and in ruling ourselves. Finally, freedom must reckon with all the powers that are difficult or impossible to democratize. These are not only the material powers of economy and society that dominate us today, capitalist, technological, white supremacist, patriarchal, and more, but also powers carried in linguistic, discursive, and even psychic registers. The challenge of such reckoning reminds us that freedom is always an endeavor, a struggle, a process, not an achievement and not a state. It is the persistent endeavor to know, to handle, and to govern human powers that otherwise dominate us and the planet we have yet to steward with care. Obrigado.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you very much for this fascinating conference. And I have to tell you that besides being so incredibly important and strong, theoretically speaking, it's terrifying how much we can feel close to your thoughts coming from the United States, thinking about the United States, and how close we are to that. So I think it's really terrifying how much we can now approach this kind of authoritarianism and the way freedom is being weaponed against our possibilities as free humans in our planet. So thank you so much for bringing this, your thoughts, and for bringing your writings to us as well, because they have been very important for us to think what's going on around the world and in Brazil in peculiar as well. So we have some questions, and I will read some of them. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to switch to Portuguese now. I forgot.
Before you do that, can I just say that,
of course,
besides being sad that I'm not able to be in Brazil and we're not all able to be together, which I hope we can do someday, I was very aware as I was preparing this talk that it was actually very fortunate that it was Brazil and not New Zealand that I was giving this talk to, because we share so much at this point, our two nations. There are differences, obviously, very big differences, but there's so much that's terrible in common that I realized that my work that is more centered in the global north would translate better, sadly, to Brazil than anywhere else. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, yes, it's really, that's why I said it's really terrifying how much it translates to our challenges here, and how much it actually lets us know how great and serious these challenges are at this moment. Bom, eu passo então para o português. Como vocês acompanharam, eu estava apenas agradecendo à professora Wendy Brown por essa incrível conferência. Eu queria lembrar vocês que nós estamos recebendo questões. A professora Wendy Brown se dispôs muito gentilmente a dialogar conosco nessa circunstância que é tão distinta de quando estamos juntos em um espaço coletivo, né? Eu tenho já algumas questões aqui que eu vou colocar para ela e depois eu volto a observar também as questões que estão sendo colocadas no chat, tanto do Zoom quanto do YouTube, tá bem? Wendy, as we had agreed, I will read the questions in English. Actually, most of them have been written in English, and the ones that have not, I will translate them for you. If you agree with that, I will read some questions, like 4 or 5 questions, so that you can make your comments together. And the first question comes from Karin Arthur. She asked you if you could talk about the role of law in reducing freedom in its collective dimension. Then we have a question from Julie Stefanini. She asks, Wendy Brown, why neoliberalism gave up on liberal democracy to embrace populism and fascism ideas in the last years? Then we have, let me just see, because there was one question here on the chat that maybe is closer to these others. Yes, so there are others here. I will try to bring the ones which are closest one to the other first. Leticia Cesarino asks, what about liberal freedom's foundations in secularism? If you could talk a bit about that. And Isabella Fernandes asks, Professor Brown, is neoliberal freedom just an extreme version of negative freedom as it appears in Constant? Or should it be understood by a new paradigm? Would it be okay if I read, 2 other questions, Wendy? They are a little different from the previous ones. If you want, I can wait for your answers. Okay, you go ahead. You have the floor, and then I'll go back to them. Okay, thank you.
Only because as I get older, it's harder to keep it all there. Okay.
No, you were right. It's better like that.
Thank you. And I'll try to respond to these, but be brief enough that we have time for more. So I have Kari's question first, the role of law in reducing freedom. So I think this really varies in in converting freedom to its current form. This really varies country to country because that's where law is made. And in the United States, there is just no question that what we call the Chicago School of Law and Economics has really come to saturate our higher courts, and especially our Supreme Court. And one of the effects of that has been, the Chicago School of Law and Economics is basically law, neoliberalism brought to law. And it's a very powerful form of training young legal thinkers, which many people think is just a conservative training, but it's more than that. It's the form of interpreting law and constitution that has brought us deregulation as freedom, eliminating restrictions on campaign finance as freedom, extending the rights and liberties of corporations to include corporations having the right to religious liberty in order to prohibit funds that they invest in health insurance being used for abortions or contraception. That is understood as a form of freedom for corporations because corporations are understood to have conscience just like any other human, because the Chicago School of Law and Economics helped establish corporations as persons and extend those same rights. So the role of law in the US has been tremendous in neoliberalizing our society, our economy, and our understanding of freedom. Freedom, as it's handled by the neoliberal justices, I'll just call them that, on the Supreme Court, always takes place in a marketplace, or is the emanation of somebody's Christian values. Those are really the two possibilities. And that's novel. That's a break from secularism. That's a break from concern with equality. And that's a break from using civil liberties to empower citizens and restrain the powers of society that would be incursions on citizens, including corporate power. So, long-winded answer to Kari, it's a huge area in the United States, the question of how law operates here. And I can commend quite a few books for you on this topic if you're interested. One of my favorites is by Tim Kuhner. I could write it in the chat, but I can't write and think and talk at the same time. It's Kuhner, and it's called Capitalism v. Democracy. But there are many others who've written on what we now call neoliberal jurisprudence. Julie asked, why did neoliberalism give up on liberal democracy to embrace fascism and populism? So I don't think that it gave up on liberal democracy. I think what I'm trying to suggest is that neoliberalism was always attenuating liberal democracy, trying to preserve liberalism while attenuating the democratic dimension of it, attenuating popular sovereignty, attenuating the idea of a robust and educated citizenship and so forth. But it inadvertently, and this is what I argue in my last book, ended up producing an effect generating what we call populism today with certain neo-fascist tendencies. And that effect was an anti-democratic people produced by neoliberalism screaming about their rights, their traditional morality, and their freedom against what neoliberalism had demonized as the social state, social progress, social justice, egalitarianism, and so forth. So my argument is not that neoliberalism was a thing that was doing one thing, gave up on it, and then went to another thing, but rather that neoliberalism as a form of reason, a form of governing reason, both a political economy and a jurisprudence and a particular form of statism inadvertently generated a populist authoritarianism, if you want to call it that. I'm a little less eager to call it populism for various reasons, but we don't have to get into that. Letitia asked, what about liberal freedoms foundation in secularism? So I have two answers here. There's no doubt that formally secularism and liberalism were born as twins. But so much good work has been done lately on challenging our received notions of secularism, recognizing that secularism certainly did do some work to break apart church and state, to privatize religion, but it also was a way of reproducing the hegemony of Christianity. And there's so much good work on this. I mean, Saba Mahmoud is one, but there are also many others who have done this work in sort of rethinking secularism, including at its origins. Joan Scott also has a terrific book really taking apart the notion that secularism and gender equality were one. If you're interested in this work, I refer you to the blog that has now been, I think is probably more than a dozen years old, called The Immanent Frame. But this said, liberalism certainly was born with with a particular secular deal as part of what it offered us. And you could also say secularism as we know it today is impossible without a liberal understanding of the private individual as a privately believing religious subject. But what I'm suggesting is that the neoliberals challenge that part of liberalism. They challenge it how? They challenge it by arguing that the private individual and the moral order that has been privatized by secularism rightly organizes the whole of what we call society. And you really see this in Hayek, in the order liberals, you see it in Thatcherism, that the proper moral order for this for the social whole emanates from that area that has been privatized by secularism. And this empowers what were formerly private claims about the true, the good, the religious, what you believe, how you practice your belief. This empowers those claims to move back out into the social domain and attack what is now called secularism, equality, and it's securing by rights, to attack secularism in schools, in the courts, in the public sphere, and so forth. And so the battle that is taking place today in your country and mine about whether traditional Christian values ought to organize the society as a whole, I'm suggesting you can see the origins of that battle in the neoliberal challenge to the idea that the private sphere ought to be contained to the family, to the genuinely private. Instead, it ought to move out into what we call the social. And Hayek again and the ordo liberals, thinkers like Rupke, are the most explicit about this. But I'm suggesting you also see it in Reaganism. You see it in Thatcherism. You see it in the arguments about what moral order is natural as opposed to what social engineering, social justice, etc., has done to the civic sphere. Last question, and then I'll try to be briefer with the next group. Is neoliberalism just an extreme version of liberalism? In some ways, I think yes, because as I've suggested, it's a version of liberalism that takes the centrality of private property and private liberty and the individual's rights and an ostensibly minimal state, although the police state and the authoritarian state and so forth are another matter, and puts that notion on steroids. But I actually want to say that the real answer and the long answer is no. Neoliberalism is a modified version of liberalism. It's neo. Why? Because it's really detaching liberalism from democracy, and it's changing the role of the state from being what the classic liberal figured as the night watchman state, just kind of being there to protect us and secure our rights, to an understanding of the state as needing to secure the orders of markets and morals that are the appropriately governing orders. And the state has forces and powers that ought to be dedicated to that. So it's really changing the understanding of what the state is about and for, but it's also changing the understanding of what is appropriately privatized, marketized, and moralized. And it's getting rid of the domain called society, in which we are supposed to have some modest civility, connectivity, and so forth with one another. So the very notion of civil society that's quite important to early liberalism is incoherent in neoliberalism. It's gone. What you have instead is private corporations, private individuals, private families on the one hand, and on the other hand, a state that secures the coordinates of market and moral orders. That's a different liberalism than anything prior to the neoliberals imagined, even the most extreme of them, the really minimal state, anti-statist types. Okay, let's have some more questions and I'll be more brief in the next set of answers.
No, it's great. You don't need to be more brief. It's great for us. It's fine. You just think of your own time. Okay, so I will read some more questions. Okay, I will start by Joanildo Buriti, who asks, considering the challenging reversal of the meaning and practice of freedom as a result of long-term cultural and political disputes from forms of thought that were never at home with democracy, are we at least for now condemned to hope for minor forms of resistance and change? How not to become resentful of such narrow limits or possibilities and thus reinforce the resentment that is now bound up with freedom? Maybe this could be connected to a straighter question by Denilson Marques dos Santos, who says, why is it impossible to feel excited about politics today? I'm not sure if it's impossible to feel excited, but maybe the connection to resentment could be commented by you. Now, Ricardo Fabrino, who says that he's very happy to meet you again, now online here this time. He asks, several emancipatory words or concepts
Could you start?
seem to, okay, several emancipatory words or concepts seem to have been kidnapped and deeply displaced. They now mean the opposite of what they were intended to mean. As Jody Dean diagnosed, progressive actors seem wordless and thoughtless, since their words no longer mean what they wanted them to mean. Should progressive actors struggle to regain their words or invent new language forms and push the boundaries of thinking? Can I go on with two more questions, Wendy? Would you be comfortable?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So now, André Duarte asks, do you think that concepts such as illiberal democracy and immunitarian democracy are adequate to describe the recent turns of democracy against its libertarian roots, although without strictly collapsing into dictatorships?
I'm not sure I understand. Could you ask that again?
Okay. So do you think that concepts such as illiberal democracy and immunitarian democracy are adequate to describe the recent turns of democracy against its libertarian roots, although without strictly collapsing into dictatorships?
Okay.
Okay, there are, Wendy, just so if you want to comment on them, there are two questions which are more specifically concerning Latin America and the United States. They are not theoretical ones, although they connect to your discussion, of course. One of them asks if the success of the left in Bolivia now, the return of left-wing groups to Argentinian government, if these could signal that Latin America could be getting close to a new turn and getting further from neoliberal destruction. Mm-hmm. This is one of the questions. And the other asks about the effect of neoliberalism in the US university system. In US universities, the effects of neoliberal politics in U.S. universities. It goes further from the others. So, okay, just so if you do have the time to comment on them, it would be great. Thank you again.
Okay. These are terrific questions. So hard not to be together. I will say the advantage, though, of questions in the chat function is they're so concisely formulated compared to what happens when we all stand up in a hall and start going on and on and on with our questions. So I'm just appreciating that aspect of this format. Is minor resistance and change all we can hope for? And how do we avoid resentment here? I'm going to link that question to the why is it impossible to feel excited by politics? So first of all, I do think resistance and minor changes matter. I think they always matter for two reasons. They matter because they incite or inspire others to become politically motivated. They matter for a lot of reasons. They matter because you're not giving in to the collapse and despair and hopelessness that is so easy to have. They matter because they keep a little, we call it a pilot light. There must be do you have this word? It's the little flame on the stove that you need in order to ignite the big fire. They keep that pilot light lit so that at the moment that something bigger becomes possible, that organization and connection and some political experience and political discipline has all been part of what can pour into the streets and the State House and elsewhere. So it's not nothing, minor resistance and change, but given the condition of the world, given the perils that both democracy and the planet face, it's not enough. We have to keep thinking bigger. We have to keep reaching for bigger. And that gets to the why is it impossible to feel excited about politics? I think about the first few years of the Trump regime here as a time when it was almost impossible to want to do anything other than write about it. But it was really hard to chase down every horror and respond to it. And then in this country came the Black Lives Matter movement. And I can't describe for you how transformative the eruption of that movement was in altering millions and millions and millions of people's sensibilities about what was possible and doable. It wasn't just that we flooded into the streets. It was that suddenly there was the kind of realization that there were extraordinarily sophisticated and reasonable demands for justice, for sustainability, for democracy, for socialism that were harbored not just by little groups of people making themselves miserable, having the conversation one more time over bad coffee and cigarettes, but rather millions and millions and millions of young people leading the rest of us in the beginnings of a social revolution. It's not done. It's not stopped climate change. It's not yet brought Trump down, though I think it's a really important part of what kneecapped him. Do you have that phrase? Kneecapped? Okay. Challenged, made him, weakened him. And it is a social revolution that is now going to persist, I am quite confident, in demanding racial justice in every quarter and corner of American life. And it began to link very rapidly with feminist and climate extinction, anti-climate extinction movements, and other kinds of social justice movements, developed mutual aid societies, and so forth. It's hard to express how powerful this was and is in the United States. And I think it also really galvanized the organizing against Trump and for a different future. Obviously, many young people felt completely thrown under the bus by the fact that their candidate of choice, Bernie Sanders, was axed by the Democratic Party. That's another story. But I just am telling you this story because I'm saying that nobody felt excited about politics for years, even prior to Trump, but for years. And then this year, from the ages of 10 to the ages of 90, there is an excitement here that I haven't seen for a long time, probably since the 1960s. So may it come to you soon. That maybe suggests that we should go to the last question before I do the other questions, which is how much is what's happened in Bolivia, Argentina, what's brewing in some other Latin American countries, suggesting that there may be a turn. I don't think we should think about it as a break from neoliberalism. I'm insisting that neoliberalism is a formation, a deep cultural, social, political transformation of us and everything we touch, including universities, which we'll get to in a second. And it's not as if a new regime will simply put an end to that. It's going to take a very long time. Should we find success on the left in developing larger populations that support a left agenda, and should we have one that actually is installed in power in various places, it's still going to take a long time to clean the neoliberalization of everyday life, institutions, society, culture, economy out. And we also have to deal with what we have now as a neoliberal right-wing formation that I've been talking about. So yes, I think there may be turns happening. I think that the devastation of neoliberal globalization is now lost on no one. Even the economists are saying, oops, what a thing to say after you've brought us this world. Oops, we didn't see it coming. We didn't realize it would generate the worst inequality in the history of humankind. We didn't realize that it might generate fascism. Okay, that's a tangent. Let's go back to the main point. Ricardo, emancipatory words and concepts have been displaced and distorted. Should we struggle to invent new languages? We have to use the languages that explain this world and compel others to understand it. I'm not a big fan of neologisms because they don't often extend beyond the little bubble, intellectual or political bubble that is using them. So I think it's more important for us to recognize that language slides. Signifiers are not fixed. We don't get to own freedom. We don't even get to own equality. We don't get to own justice. We fill these things with content. If freedom has been developed in a particular way that I've described and owned by the right, we need a formulation of freedom that has in it our mutual vulnerability and connectedness, our connection to the planet, the need to put responsibility at its heart, the need to understand it as a social and political form. We can do that, but we need to not back away from the term and come up with like a bunch of other terms that don't mean anything to people if where people are living is in the language of, I want to be free. So that's my answer to that. And finally, Andres, are terms like illiberal democracy and immunitarian democracy adequate? I think illiberal democracy is really a trick, because I'm suggesting I don't think that even the illiberal democracy, so-called, of Hungary is fully illiberal. I think even it's illiberal toward outsiders, no doubt about it. But liberalism has always been illiberal toward outsiders. So that's a kind of strange line to pretend that we're drawing all of a sudden, that we have to be liberal toward all. We never have been. It would be a good idea someday. But, you know, the founding text of liberalism in John Stuart Mill says, no, it's about us in Europe. And then the rest of those people we get to colonize and govern because they're pygmies. So illiberal democracy is, I'm suggesting, actually anti-democratic, illiberal authoritarianism. And I think it's important for us to bust those terms, not just say they're not adequate, but to see what they're covering up. The university. Well, yes. So is the question, has neoliberalism also gotten its fingers into or done its damage in the university, or is it a bigger question than that, Flavia?
I think it had to do with damages, really, damages to universities, how it has affected university life and possibilities.
So I think it's just been huge, absolutely huge. And I've been working on this for probably 15 years, but mostly as a activist, more than, I've written a few things, but mostly I, talk about it and work against it. I think that the most important thing that neoliberalization has done to American universities, besides defund them and put them on an increasingly privatized basis, meaning replace public funds with tuition and donor funds, which in turn changes what's offered and how we decide what's offered. The most important thing that's happened is that neoliberalization has turned both funders and students into creatures who aren't invested in universities as places where you become educated for democracy or the public interest, but rather where you go simply to enhance your own individual human capital. And that phenomenon has been so devastating to curriculums, to decisions about programs, to what gets a lot of funding and what gets very little, so that, political theory, Latin American literature, art, music, but also basic research, all of those things that are not understood as commercializable by those who fund them, or all of those things that are not considered an enhancement of one's human capital and making one ready for a vocation or a job in an immediate training sense. All of those things are being compressed. All of those things are increasingly reduced to radically sidelined in the contemporary university. The other huge effect, of course, has been the effort to cheapen teaching, or what's called now instructional delivery, no different from any other delivery. So the effort to cheapen instructional delivery means more and more adjunct lecturers. Here, that just means people without any permanent position. They're not treated as researchers. They're just brought in to teach a class. And the pay and the benefits are positively scandalous. Scandalous because on the one hand, they're treated just as people who are delivering goods. But on the other hand, the low pay still imagines that people do the kind of work we do because they get some reward for their soul in it. So I don't know if this can translate quickly, but the average pay for a single course for a lecturer here can be as little as $1,000 a semester. So as little as $350 a month, and no benefits. And, we still have no national health care to speak of. So no healthcare, and so forth. So what the university is doing, a neoliberalized university, is bringing in more and more people to teach who they are literally keeping below the poverty line. And they're doing more and more to essentially move faculty out as people who would in any way control our curriculums or the future of our departments. There's a lot more to say about neoliberalization. It's been devastating to research. It means people design their research in order to figure out where the money might be to fund it, instead of according to what questions or what public good they think their research might offer. Flavia, where are we? Do we have more minutes?
Okay, so yeah, we have 15 more minutes if it's okay for you. Is it fine? Okay. I'm very sorry to say that we can understand perfectly what you are saying about the neoliberalization of universities in the US, and we are going through this process at this exact moment in Brazil. So I think many people recognized their own experience in what you have just said now. So Wendy, we do have some more questions here. I will read them. One comes from Clarice Goulart Paradis. Clarice asks, dear Professor Wendy Brown, have some progressive sectors and left-wing parties lost the capacity to face neoliberalism? Have their conceptions of freedom become detached from conceptions of equality? Now, Su Yamamoto asks, is it possible to call these new far right in US and Brazil nationalists? And how does this relate to the new liberal idea of individual Christian freedom? And there is a third question by Julie Stefanini. No, I'm sorry. Now, these are some compliments. I have arrived to so many compliments here, Wendy. I think you can stick to these two questions, and I will read some of the compliments later.
I get too embarrassed. But you know what? I need you to repeat the really interesting question about nationalism and the far right. I thought I didn't write it down.
Okay. So, okay. She asks if the far right, she actually describes a new far right in US and Brazil, and asks you if we should call them nationalists, and if nationalism appearing now among the far right could be related to the new liberal idea of individual Christian freedom.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. There's one thing that I thought of asking now, that, if you allow me. I was thinking of one thing that you said about how during your conference, about how markets are presented as being not coercive forces, and how the idea of coercion is being disputed now when we face this far right nationalist and at the same time neoliberal far right. And in Brazil, we have been also seeing a dispute about what is and what's not violent. So violence is presented as not being violence, indeed. So if you could comment on that, how this coercion doesn't mean coercion, because choice would be involved in what market is concerned, but violence itself is presented as something else. And the own meaning of violence is being disputed, and Bolsonaro is really a leader in that. We can really see some of the things he said during the pandemic, and even during the electoral campaign. I really connected to what I ask you now. Okay, so thank you.
Okay. So first it was Clarice, yeah? The first question. Have
Yes.
progressives lost the ability or wandering away from the ability to fight neoliberalism? Are they giving in some ways and accepting its terms? I think that's really what's being asked here. In our struggles against the neoliberalized university, I found nothing more difficult to deal with than the progressives who said, look, this is the way it is. We're being privatized, we're being monetized. What we have to do is figure out how to just exploit this for our own purposes. And this means don't fight the terms, don't fight the language, don't fight the outsourcing, accept that this is roughly the way the university is going and that it's too powerful a force. As Margaret Thatcher reminded us when she rolled out the idea of TINA, there is no alternative. It's too powerful a force to fight. So what we have to do is just carve out our possibilities within. The reason I found this so fighting this was worse than fighting those who ardently defended the neoliberalization, because they spoke the language on one side of the values of caring for the humanities and wanting students to still have an affordable education and offer an education that still was broad and deep and critical and so forth. But engaged in this surrender that was much more undermining for our struggle than those we were actually fighting. More generally, I think there's lots and lots of so-called progressives, kind of left of center types that have just completely accepted privatization, public-private partnerships, the outsourcing of everything, the neoliberal race to the bottom. And all they want to do is figure out how to provide some safety nets that the hard right is not interested in. And they want to protect, I'm just going to call it this, the easy multicultural issues. They want to stand for gender equality. They want to stand for racial equality. They want to stand for minority sexual rights. That's all good to do, but they find, but they have no critical apparatus at all for the way that neoliberalism is threaded through all of these things, and also what neoliberalism is doing in the big sense to the nation, to the planet, to the world, to the things we value, to democracy, to public life, to public goods. So I think we have to resist it. I mean, I think my own relationship to that lost desire for the fight is to try to get them to change and to fight with such people, to try to keep illuminating the damages and to remind us that we can't be gradualist about the climate. We can't be gradualist about democracy. Capitalism is not going to solve our problems. I mean, we can regulate the hell out of it, and we still have the problem of an extractivist, growth-based, profit-driven political economy that is not going to solve the huge problems, human and planetary, that we have produced on this earth. So the new far right that's nationalist, how does the nationalism and the ethno-nationalism in the case of many Euro-Atlantic countries, how does the nationalism relate to the individual Christian freedom that is also being fought for? I think our two countries share this. I think. You'll tell me probably if this is not true. I think that in both cases, the individual Christian freedom that is being sought to be expressing itself in bigger and bigger areas, and that is fighting the social equality that it sees as damning us all to hell, I think that that struggle to build on and expand individual Christian freedom is actually about a re-Christianization of the nation. I think it ties absolutely to nationalism. I think that it absolutely is a nationalist project. It's explicit in my country. It's, the Christian right is all about making us a Christian nation again. But their way of doing it is through enhancing the power of individuals and corporations and small regions to assert their Christianity and push back against what they see as the secular or anti-Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or other, let alone indigenous. We pretty much don't have that. But that is the strategy, is to do it through liberalism rather than a coup. And that's what I've been arguing for last hour and a half. So I think Sue's question is answered by the fact that the new far right is a Christian nationalist right for the most part, and an ethno-nationalist Christian right whose strategies and tactics are achieved through individual freedom protected by liberalism. Flavia, your question is so interesting. So, the non-coercion of markets that the neoliberals believe in, that you have all of this choice. I think to the extent that neoliberalism takes the model of markets, and I'm also suggesting the model of traditional morality, which again, you're understood to have choice within. You may be somewhere low on the hierarchy as a woman or as a sexual minority or something else, but the idea is if you don't subscribe to it, you can choose away from it. But in both cases, I think what we're seeing is that this idea of choice as being the way to allow freedom to run all over society permits an enormous amount of suffering, death, dying, and violence. And your question is about violence. What counts as violence? Does it count as violence when we have a president who has allowed 240,000 Americans to die of COVID because of his irresponsibility? Is that violence? I think it's violence. Or is it only the case, as he would suggest, that violence is represented by protesters in the street, outraged by a violent police force that polices Blacks to death? So we also are having this argument, this discussion. And I think, again, what you've reminded us is that the discussion itself is in some ways framed by a neoliberal discourse about freedom and choice. Everybody has the choice to do what they want in relationship to the pandemic. That's the dream of Bolsonaro and Trump. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask. Social distance, don't social distance. It's all up to you, but we're not going to require anything. That framing by our two presidents has generated a huge amount of death and dying, including people who actually had no choice but to go to work, had no choice but to come into contact with the virus, regardless of what they actually felt or believed, because their survival depended upon it. So we are very much in the cross-hatching of a language of choice that disavows not only power, but violence as part of the effect of a choosing world, a world that you only choose in and that you're free as long as you can choose in. And then on the other hand, there is, of course, in the case of both regimes, an explanation of why so much state violence is now being unfurled on the people. And that's to protect their choice. That's to protect their freedom. It's to protect them against those of us who are protesting or who are mobilizing or who are seeking another form of order.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Really, the conference was fascinating, and your comments now were so great that we felt close to you. So technology was really, in this case, a means to feel close and to be able to listen to you carefully and listen to your always careful comments was really incredible for us. I know you said you feel embarrassed, but I will just read some few compliments. There are so many, but Madalena says, what a pleasure to hear your analysis, Professor Brown, despite the political scenarios in Brazil and the United States. Julie says, thank you so much, dear professor. Your work is fundamental and urgent at the moment. Luciana Tatajiba says, Brown's availability and intellectual generosity is a relief in these tough times. Eva says, happy and grateful for this opportunity. And Gabrielle says, your talk calls on us to rethink the role of academics and its relation with the world around us. Leticia says, wonderful talk. Looking forward to the next book. So I finished with this one, just to say that maybe we can have the launch of your next book translated to Portuguese with you presentially with us here in Brazil. It would be such a pleasure for us. So thank you so much again. I will just remind people in Portuguese of what we have in the next days, but I'm very happy that we could, please go ahead.
Thank you, Flavia, and thanks to all of you for participating in this strange format. There is some kind of intimacy combined with estrangement, but I appreciated that one of you said before we even started that we are separated, but we are not. I can't remember. It was that we were separated from one another, but not disconnected. And it is true, we are separated, but not disconnected. So I wish you all good things, solidarity. May both of our regimes come tumbling down soon. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much again, Wendy. Tchau. Muito obrigada a você e a todas e todos que estiveram conosco nessa noite. Nós não poderíamos, no meu entendimento, ter um início de conferência mais forte e acertado do que ouvindo Wendy Brown nessa noite. Eu queria lembrar a vocês que a partir de amanhã, às 9 da manhã, teremos várias atividades simultâneas. Amanhã à noite, inclusive, mais uma conferência internacional sobre democracia na América Latina. E também queria lembrar a vocês de uma questão técnica mais importante para que essa fala de hoje de Wendy Brown seja acessível às pessoas. Nós optamos por uma legendagem que é feita ao vivo, né, já que a fala dela é ao vivo. E isso, é claro, gera alguns pequenos problemas na legendagem. Então, o que nós faremos agora é editar essa legendagem, né, para que ela fique o mais fiel possível à fala de Wendy Brown, e então a conferência estará disponível online com a legenda, os subtítulos, né, editados. Bom, esperamos, então, que tenha sido uma noite importante para vocês, como foi para nós da ABCP, ao abrir essa conferência nessas circunstâncias, e esperamos ver a todas e todos nos próximos dias pelos corredores virtuais do nosso 12º encontro. Muito obrigada novamente, boa noite a todas e todos.